Hello there, I'm here to talk about a book called The Fifth Sorceress, and, it fucking sucks.
This is the introduction song. It's not very good, but it's not too long.
You know, it's not a good idea to go into something with expectations, but when I first started reading this, I thought it had potential. I mean, it started off okay. The beginning is decent enough. It gives you hints of what's to come, and it introduces you to a sort of neat world and all. But the more time goes on, the more you just the more you start to realize that this book has nothing new in it whatsoever. Okay, this is aggressively generic. Someone who has never read fantasy, never heard of fantasy stories, they only saw 5 minutes of Return of the King one time on TNT. Someone like that could write a more original book than this pile of shit. I don't have a copy, because just like my last review, I read it on my phone, but fuck, that's probably a good thing, because I might burn it if that were the case, because this is shit. Just utter shit is what this is, okay? But, okay, you're here to hear about why, so let's get into that. So like I said, this book starts off pretty decent, actually. The prologue is the aftermath of this thing called the Sorceress War, and this wizard is taking the final 4 sorceresses in the world, and because of his vows, he can't just kill them, so he just takes them on a boat way out in the middle of the ocean, and then puts them on lifeboats and sends them away so that hopefully they'll die on the boat, and they'll never have to hear from him again. But the sorceresses are talking, and they say that there's actually a 5th sorceress out there somewhere, and one day they're gonna come back and take over. So, yeah, the beginning of this book is okay. You know, it shows us a giant war, it hints at what's to come, and, I mean, it gave me hope. But then immediately afterwards, it skips forward 300 years, we're introduced to our man-child of a protagonist, who, at first, I was kinda intrigued because he's not a farm boy, he's a prince. Okay, well that's nice, but he's also a prince that doesn't want to be king and wants to run away from all his royal duties. Okay, there's like 8 or 9 points against you right there, in terms of cliché. Honestly, Tristan... I'll get to him in a second. Just give me a second. So, it skips forward 300 years, we're introduced to him. We hear about prophecies, obviously, because you can't have a aggressively bland fantasy book without some sort of prophecy or chosen one. And from there, the plot begins. Of course, I say plot, it's really just a series of monologues. Just a good guy saying, hey, here's what we need to do in excruciating page-long detail. And then evil people saying, hey, we're evil. Let's explain why I'm evil in 3 pages of dialogue. And Tristan will do something stupid, and then it ends. And just, when it ended, this weight was lifted off of my shoulders, and I felt so much younger, but also so much older at the same time. It's impossible to explain for those of you who haven't read it, but I wouldn't wish any of you to read it. I wouldn't wish that sort of punishment upon anyone. So, yeah, I don't spoil things, but this plot is about as generic as they come for pretty much the whole thing. You know, the first 50 pages, it's just the main character, Tristan, in the woods. And he's doing things and complaining about his life. And then he finds something magic and kinda interesting, which, okay, once it got to that point, I was like, okay, this is a little bit more interesting. They never really do much with that, though, so it wasn't nearly as interesting as I thought. So then it goes down again. But then, around 200 pages in, the plot kicks up again, and I was like, okay, this is kinda interesting, and then it goes down again. and it just stays that way for the rest of the book. There's nothing original about the plot at all, okay? It's evil people for the sake of being evil, chosen one trying to save the world, okay? I think I've been redundant enough with that already. Let's just move on. See, the thing about cliched stories is that they can still kind of work if you have decent characters, and this book did not have that. Now, there were two that I thought were okay. There was a Wig, who is the leader of the Directorate of Wizards, and he's actually the first character you see in the book, and he's just this super powerful, badass, immortal wizard, who, again, he's a badass, but he does have limitations on what he can do, so it's not like he just swoops in and saves the day as a Mary Sue all the time. And he just is very loyal to the prince. He wants to help people. He wants to atone for some bad things that he did in the past, and he's actually alright. But at the same time, he's basically just every badass mentor character that has ever been in fantasy ever, so it's not like he's doing a whole lot new, but it is better than nothing. And the other one is a little bit more original. He's just a slave that's kept by one of the sorceresses, and I won't go into any detail about him because of spoilers, but he's actually quite a bit better than I would have expected at the beginning. Every other character is just stupid or boring or some combination thereof. Like, Tristan is a complete fucking retard, fucking man-child, fucking fuck, okay? Like, so to the point where I can't think of words other than fuck to describe him. Okay, he's constantly whining about how he doesn't want the responsibility that's been thrust upon him. He constantly does stupid shit, even knowing beforehand that it's stupid to do, but he just can't bring himself to not do it. And that could be an interesting character flaw if it weren't for the fact that he just repeatedly does it over and over again, and for the fact that he's directly rewarded for it several times. I mean, like, this is like a 14-year-old who wants to have some sort of power fantasy about being the nicest hero that everyone loves and all the girls want to get with. There is nothing about him that is interesting or unique or even likable, honestly. Like, he has no personality just beyond being a helpful dumbass. The villains, like I said, they're just evil for the sake of being evil. I don't feel the need to go into much detail on that. The other main characters besides Tristan are just there to explain stuff to us. You know, they're there to explain something about the magic, or something about something that happened 100 years ago, or they're there to torture a slave just because, fuck it. Who cares, right? You know, who needs world building that's subtle and woven into the plot? No. We just want 7-page long monologues of characters explaining stuff. And they never really go into detail about it either. I'll get to that in just a second. Essentially, this is a generic fantasy cast pumped up to 11. Like, if you've ever read Aragon, you know that a lot of the characters in that are not particularly interesting. But most of them are still fairly likable, and, you know, they just play up the tropes in a good way. You know, they aren't new or unique, but they do it well. This does not do either of those. It's something we've seen a million times before. You know, the wise old mentor, the helpful protagonist that always seems to get himself into trouble. His best friend who's really good at sword fighting for some reason. Or I shouldn't say for some reason, because, okay, they do actually give an explanation for that, but it's still stupid. And there's the outcast, old crippled wizard. Like, we've all heard of this a million times. And it just doesn't even do it well. It's like if you did paint by numbers with a bucket of white paint. Okay, that's what this book's character cast is like. Just filling in gaps that you feel you need to for the story, but forgetting to add anything interesting to it. The world is pretty much the same. I mean, I'd say it's a ripoff of Middle-earth, but I don't really know because we get very little detail about it, all things considered. Like, they talk a lot about magic, but we never really get an idea of how it works, or what it can do, and what it can't do. So, I'm always left wondering, well, why doesn't Wig just do this? Or, why can't the sorceresses just do this instead? Or, do they need this to do this? Why don't they just blow everything up? I don't get it. There's a couple of fantasy races in this as well, which aren't horrible, but they don't really seem to add much. Like, the gnomes are just sort of there. There's these things called Wictor, which, again, are just sort of there, even if they're kind of cool. The only ones that actually fit into the story in any way are these guys called minions, which were actually created by the sorceresses, and they're kind of cool. I'll give them a pass for that. But other than that, like, we don't get a sense of how this world works. We don't get a sense of how people live in it. We don't get a sense of any sort of history about it, except for the Sorceresses' War, but, you know, that was 300 years ago. We don't know anything that happened before that, and we don't know what happened between then and now, really. We just know things happen, people exist. There's nothing to go into, really. Like, at least with something like fucking Blood Rose Rebellion, which I hate, and had one of the shittiest worlds ever, I could actually go into that and pick apart why it was stupid. Because despite everything, the world building was at least not paper thin. But with this, it's just... It's like not even for decoration, it just is there, but then if you look at it for too long, it disappears. So, for that reason alone, this is probably the weakest fantasy world I've ever seen, and that's saying a lot. Not only is that just sad, because fantasy is something where you're supposed to go nuts and have total creative freedom with, this is just... I can't even think of words for it. It's just so bland that it's like eating white bread with saltine crackers on top. So I think you have an idea on the broad strokes of what makes this book so shitty, but I don't think it's fair to stop there, because the Fifth Sorceress is kind of worse than that. Now, it's difficult to explain without actually just reading long passages out of the book, but the writing in this is just atrocious in the worst way possible. And I know that might sound vague, but I think I mentioned there are page-long monologues from pretty much every character at some point or another, just explaining something that we don't need explained. And then immediately afterwards, they'll do the thing that they just explained with the exact same amount of words and everything. Like, at one point, for example, they need to swim under a moat, so they need to open a grate at the bottom, and then swim out, and swim up. Okay, sounds pretty simple. The character that tells them to do that spends, I think, 2 pages, literally, 2 pages, telling them what they need to do. Like, he explains, okay, you need to hold your breath. No shit. You need to hold onto my hand, okay. Follow me along, okay. And then once I let go of your hand, that means we're through, and you can just go to the surface. Now, you can describe that in a couple of sentences. He just spends the whole couple pages doing that, and then they spend like 3 pages, 3 pages, sorry, wrong angle, I don't give a fuck. They spend like 3 pages actually explaining how they go through there, and then Tristan gets stuck for a minute, and then he gets pulled out. Yeah, that was really necessary. We really needed all that detail there. I think there are 4 or 5 different women in this book that Tristan meets that he describes as impossibly beautiful, or the most beautiful woman he's ever seen. Like, it starts off with some random noblewoman he meets at the castle, or the palace, I don't care, whatever the fuck it's called, palace, we'll say. And then later he's traveling in the woods and he meets a barmaid, and again he describes her as the most beautiful woman ever. And then later he meets another woman who's been tortured and raped repeatedly, and as soon as he sees her, he's like, oh hey, that's the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. I just, I give up. Okay, I give up. Okay, I don't know how else I can describe this without explaining every detail of the plot. So, I think I'm just about done here. There is, however, one positive thing I want to say. Now, I told you there were two characters I kind of liked, and those two are what really got me through this. But the one thing about this book that I kind of liked was the absurd violence. Now, this book is not for people who are squeamish, okay? The violence in this is turned up to fucking 11. Alright, there is some depraved, sadistic shit in here. There's physical violence, where they, like, mutilate bodies. They, at one point, they cut off a bunch of people's heads, and then they shove a knife with a rope attached through their skulls, and just chain all their heads together, and carry it around. Like, what? That's completely fucked up and crazy. And then they get, like, mutilating bodies. At one point they describe bodies being stacked up. They also have, like, sexual violence out the wazoo. They got psychological violence. Like, this shit, I wouldn't blame you if it's hard to read, honestly. It gets fucked up. But here's the thing about that. It's exploitative. It's kind of stupid. It doesn't really add anything to the story. But it does give it its own identity. Like, this book is just so devoid of any sort of spice or originality of any sort, and it's nice to have something that just stands out at all. I wouldn't really say that this saves anything, because it doesn't, but the fact that I can even remember that happened means that it's left some sort of impact on me. And the majority of this book didn't do that, except for Tristan doing something stupid. So, for that reason, I can't say this is the worst book ever, or the most bland book ever, because it does have that one thing that gives it its own identity. It's still a shitty book, though. I mean that's basically the difference between a 1 out of 10 and a 2 out of 10. So that's the Fifth Sorceress. Don't read it, okay? It's, I mean, I originally heard about it as a flop. Like, I'm not even joking. I heard about it as a book that was expected to do well, and then it did horribly. And I thought it sounded interesting, so I decided to give it a shot. And no, don't read this piece of shit, okay? My next review should be something a little bit better. Just stay far, far away from the Fifth Sorceress. Please, for your own sanity as well as mine. Not today. Not today, not today, not today.